I'm Scott Loughlin. This is the Data Chronicles, and here are your data points. Today, we are discussing the current state of data protection law in the Latin America region. There is a lot going on in the data world, so it's often difficult to keep track of what is happening globally on issues like privacy, cybersecurity, incident response, and artificial intelligence. To make it more complicated, I'm referring to Latin America as if it were a single jurisdiction with a single set of laws, when in reality, it's a region with a number of countries, each of which have a different law. I'm happy to report that we have you covered with a Latin America update today so that we can discuss where we have been, what is the current enforcement trends in the region, and where are we headed? To discuss, I've invited my partner, Guillermo Larrea, to the podcast. Guillermo is in our Mexico City office and leads many of our multi-jurisdictional projects across the Latin America region. Guillermo, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Scott. It's a pleasure to be here.
So, Guillermo, I'm interested maybe in your perspective on what is happening in data protection across Latin America. Maybe before we dive into some more specific kind of issues, can you give me and our audience a perspective on where you see the landscape currently in data protection law across the region?
Sure, Scott. Well, just going back for a second, data protection has been long there in the Latin America. It's been, it pretty much started in Argentina back in 2000, Mexico 2010. And the region has been pretty much an evolution of what has been going on in Europe across the years. So when we talk about data protection, it's about looking into what happened in Europe, but then with small switches and changes specific to our region. For many years, Mexico played a very significant role in the influence of data protection laws across the Latin American region. So there's also an influence of whatever it happened and how Mexico developed in that degree into what later happened in these countries across the region. So we are now in a very interesting time in this region. I would divide it in three basic stages. First, the enactment of the very first data protection laws, then a wave of cybersecurity laws that has been going on maybe for the last 3 years, and the ultimate trend, which is, of course, the enactment and push on AI regulation, that it's all interconnected with the cybersecurity and data protection laws in the last, pretty much the last few years. Chile, for example, doing a very interesting role in that leadership. Chile just approved an interesting regulation on the cybersecurity end, and it's currently undergoing interesting discussions on AI as well.
That's really interesting, and especially kind of how Argentina maybe led the way. But now we see other countries. Obviously, Brazil has gotten a lot of attention in terms of the passage of a comprehensive data protection law. We have had Argentina, as you noted. From your perspective, to what degree is it easy to harmonize the laws across the various countries inside of Latin America?
Well, that's a very interesting question, Scott, and this is part of what we do on a daily basis. There are certainly similarities. Most of these regulations across the region used to be consent-based, and again, copied some of the initial European principles in many of these regulations. You'll find definitely similarities, but there are other differences that, make this region very unique. Just to give you a couple of examples. In the case of Brazil, Brazil allows a number of legal bases for the processing of the personal data. And in Mexico, for instance, there is no such legal basis. Pretty much the only legal basis is consent, and you either have consent or you rely on one of the exceptions available in the law. So when you're dealing with a policy that will be applying in all these countries, you need to be very careful and making sure that you are complying with the specific principles, with the specific rights of each of these countries, and that you find some point in between that it can actually operate across the region, granting specific rights when you are required to grant them. So, in a nutshell, dealing with there are similarities, but the devil is in the details, and you definitely need to look into the specific regulation to make sure that your policy is compliant with that specific regulation as well.
Right. And I think, that point that you made about how Mexico often would require consent and how historically the region has had data protection laws that were based in consent, I think continues to pop throughout the region, right? I mean, at least in my experience, there will be often requirements to obtain consent when most other laws around the world would either not require it or, in the case of the EU, would actively discourage or seemingly suggest that you should not be looking for consent. And so I'm interested in your perspective on how you work with those challenges to try to bring not only harmonization across Latin America, but also try to bring harmonization within other global frameworks, including the GDPR and some of those that are emerging in the US.
You are absolutely right. Consent is king in our region. I would say it is a conservative approach as well. But again, specifically Chile and Brazil have made changes in this respect. Again, Brazil opening to other legal bases, and this is creating a shift in the regulation across the region. Certainly, there are many proposals undergoing right now to change and allow other legal bases. But for now, if you are dealing with data protection in the Latin American region, you need to rely mostly in consent and be sure that whatever you're doing elsewhere, it resonates with the requirement here.
Yeah. And then, so you mentioned a moment ago, Guillermo, that a lot of the activity over the course of the past year or so has focused on cybersecurity and artificial intelligence, probably to the surprise of no one, given that, globally, those are two important issues that we are struggling with. Where do you see the development with AI-oriented laws, perhaps over the course of the past year that you've seen in 2024? And where do you see that going inside of the countries in Latin America?
That's a very interesting question, Scott. And I would start saying that the main focus in the LATAM region is about security. There are no common standards around security on the cyber, the AI, and data protection front that apply across the region, as in Europe, that you can take one and make sure that you're applying everything in the rest of the countries. Being that said, standards on governance such as ISO 27001, ISO, it has become a common standard in the region that many of these countries are using for security purposes and for governance purposes from the cyber endpoint and the data protection endpoint. Again, it's hard to tell and very early in time to say where this is going to land in terms of the development. But I would say that, again, Chile just enacted the national cybersecurity law in January 2025. El Salvador similarly enacted a cybersecurity and information security law in 2024. And they do have very different approaches. While El Salvador is most concerned on, let's say, national security and cybersecurity, Chile has go beyond that, and it's creating an agency responsible for protection the national cyberspace, but also creating responsibilities for corporations. It includes, the protection of data, good practices, encouraging national and international coordination, and promoting specific industry. I would say between Chile, Brazil, Uruguay have formed this sort of committee of discussions around cyber laws and AI laws. And the trend we've seen is that most of these countries are trying to promote the development of artificial intelligence. So they may not be as restrictive as perhaps Europe is already in the regulation, but we see a risk-based approach and we see concerns about the manufacturers and the developers of AI tools that will be or will have definitely some kind of impact in these countries. Again, beginning with Chile and Brazil and Uruguay for that respect. Laws have not been definitely enacted on AI. However, the regulation on the ground already requires disclosures of the use of AI tools.
Yeah, I think that obviously the transparency is a key global theme that we are seeing in a number of different places. One of the things you mentioned, Guillermo, that I wanted to double click on was the reference around the country's leaderships kind of discussing development of policy in the region. Do you see that that is common, that there is a coordination between the countries in the area around how to approach things like cybersecurity or AI or data protection to bring more synergies between those countries? Or do you see that everybody is kind of making their own decisions and their own policy making in a vacuum?
Yeah, that's very, again, important question. So I'll put it in this way. In a few years back, Mexico was pretty much the leader in terms of data protection. In fact, it had a very significant role in the region developing principles for or common standards for data protection. The Mexican Transparency and Data Protection Agency had a very significant role, and many other agencies across the regions were listening to what this institution was saying. Problem is that that's not longer the case. Mexico is undergoing a little bit of a turmoil in this respect. The Mexico's Transparency and Data Protection Agency disappeared. It's in process of disappearing, and will transfer authority to the now Ministry of Anti-Corruption and Good Government. This will happen as we speak. It will be happening in the month of March. And so this is a change of the types of standards that this institution was fighting for many years. We don't know if the criteria, the type of resolutions that INAI was taking will continue to be there in the coming years. So again, this is a tremendous shift, Plus, Mexico has created a new digital transformation and telecommunications agency that will also have a word in the cybersecurity space. And this is all happening at the same time that a number of cyber laws and AI laws are happening in Mexico. But I'll stop there for a minute to continue with your question. So from that leadership, then a few years back, we, of course, had Brazil's LGPD. Brazil's LGPD was major change, I would say the most significant one in the region dealing with data protection. Again, it resembles a lot of what the European data protection law does with respect to data protection, but it has very unique features. The ANDPD, which is the ministry in charge of the Asamblea Nacional de Protección de Datos, it's the entity in charge of pursuing, has, to be honest, has assumed a new leadership in the region and is pushing the agenda forward, specifically on the enforcement side. We've seen very recently the sanctions that this agency had on X, Elon Musk's the platform, about the use and some security issues that the X had on the ground in Brazil. So enforcement is certainly led by LGPD and the Asamblea. But at the same time, we have these other actors, as I was just pointing out in the case of Chile, that really has created a committee and a number of institutions discussing the role and the leadership of cybersecurity and AI in the region. And in fact, I would say that from AI standpoint, Chile, it's been being much more aggressive in that respect and trying to keep coordination with the rest of the agencies in terms of AI developments. Being that said, and aside from Latin America, the Latin America and the Caribbean have always been very close to Europe in terms of discussions. So we see from time to time group discussions between the agencies in the region and authorities from the European Union. Aside from that, I would say that that's pretty much the discussion. We don't see discussions with Asia nor with the United States. Latin American data protection, cyber, and AI is closer to the EU regulation and EU authorities for that matter.
So do you see that the leadership in the region is still going to come from the countries that you mentioned? I mean, it sounds like from an enforcement perspective, you said Brazil was at the leading edge. There's some uncertainty around Mexico, and then obviously some developments in leadership on AI for Chile. Is that what we can expect in terms of, who the primary voices are going to be on these issues going forward? Or do you expect that Mexico perhaps will will change with the dissolution of the formal data protection authority?
Yes, definitely will come from those countries, from Brazil, Chile. I don't see Mexico taking the lead again anytime soon, just because of the change, the significant change it had in the authority and the standards. This will take some time before it can even go back to have a regional discussion around this. And certainly, again, Chile and Brazil and Uruguay, but Uruguay size, it's definitely smaller and has sometimes less impact there on a regional perspective. But Chile and Brazil will take the lead, I'm sure, for these matters. From the cyber and AI governance, Latin American countries are also leading with the assembly of the Interparliamentary Union on AI with Europe. So these are also the connections that these countries are taking with other international agencies and councils for the discussion on AI development.
Got it. Maybe, one area that I know that we're spending a lot of time talking about with right now is cross-border data transfers. And there's been a lot of development here in the United States on that, in particular with restrictions on the transfers of data to China, likely to follow similar types of themes in the EU. And Latin America, from prior experience, has its own form of international data transfer laws and obligations. There are model clauses within Argentina. There are model clauses within Brazil. And then there's a number of places from past experience that you may require different levels of consent unless there's exceptions. Interested in your perspective about where cross-border data transfer laws sit right now, and whether you start to see that the trend that we are seeing elsewhere continue, where we start seeing more localization, more restrictions on the cross-border transfer of data, or whether you see that as not being an important theme in Latin America over the course of the next few years.
I see going forward perhaps more restrictions in terms of the standard clauses. As you pointed out, there are standard clauses in Brazil, Argentina, Colombia, that need to be followed. The authorities, since they are developing their own initiatives, they are enhancing the protocols and the requirements with respect to cross-border transfers of data. Being that said, this does not come from necessarily from a legislative change, but more from the evolution of the same of the authorities' requirements, for that matter. So when one makes a transfer across the Latin American region involving these countries, you just need to make sure that the European standard data transfer clause is applied to the specific requirements of these countries that definitely are different. You need to make sure, in the case, again, of Brazil, Argentina, Colombia, at least, or that you have the relevant consent for the transfer, which, of course, it becomes a burden and a headache to many international corporations. So it's a combination between making sure that you are aligned with local regulation, or you go into a different direction and make sure that you get the relevant consent.
Yeah, interesting. maybe one other area, which I know is a pain point for many right now, and that on the cyberspace, there are many organizations who are having incidents which are increasingly global in nature. In other words, it's almost becoming the rarity that at least multinational clients, when they have an issue, that it's only localized in the US or in the UK or in the EU, and tends to have broader implications because of the way data is stored and way data is managed. From your perspective, as you have helped many organizations through those types of cyber crises, where are you seeing the hotspots in terms of notices, areas of providing notices to individuals, providing notices to the government, and how are you helping organizations manage to those differing obligations throughout the region?
Yeah, this is my favorite spot for the time being, Scott. And the reason is because we're just fully submerged in the cybersecurity threat landscape right now in the region, the Latin American region. It is a battleground. The Latin America and the Caribbean has become the world's fastest growing region for disclosed cyber incidents, and with 20% average annual growth. And it's and the reason is very, very clear. I mean, you have big corporations on the ground operating across the region, but less sophisticated from the cybersecurity perspective. So it's just a place to be for cyber threats and attackers. They just love the place. They just have found a way to exploit better the lack of infrastructure of some of these companies. Plus, preparedness is not something that Latin American people tend to have. Most of these companies operate in a reaction scenario. So you see less preparedness for a cyber incident in this kind of aspect. So, in a nutshell, there is significant impact of cybersecurity incidents across the region, less capabilities to go around the big issues, less enforcement. The role of the enforcement agencies is not as sophisticated as you would see them in Europe and in the United States. So companies pretty much are left behind to manage the effects of the cyber incident. And that's where we come into place and help in that process. Just to give you an example, in the last year, in Lockbit, 8base, Alpha Black Cat, were kind of the most complex attacks that we had in the region. They're all over the place in companies across the region. So where do I see the big challenges? In the lack of preparedness, the less infrastructure, and that while we have a degree of development in the region on data protection laws, these developments far less complex in the cybersecurity front. You'll find many companies across the region that don't even have an incident response plan. They don't have incident response teams, and sometimes they are left behind when this happens. So they call us, and we need to start developing very unique plans to find out what happened. Coordinating with local enforcement agencies and making sure that at the same time they make the filings, for instance, with the Brazilian Data Protection Authority within 72 hours. So you can imagine the type of burden that becomes for companies operating locally. So I guess the recommendation is, if you are operating in the region, make sure that you're aligning your IT department and your legal department in bringing a full incident response program, because otherwise you'll feel the pain and in the process of an attack. That definitely is out there.
Yeah, I mean, those are really good points, Guillermo. And when we're talking about the global economy, we're also kind of talking about the global risk with respect to these cybersecurity attacks. So, as you can imagine, it's almost impossible to say that you'll have zero risk of any cybersecurity. It's just a question of how difficult you're going to make it on the attacker to be able to gain access to your infrastructure. And in particular, can you make it more difficult for your environment such that that attacker goes elsewhere? And that dynamic then creates a collective problem, because those organizations who are not leaning in to address these issues, to your point, are less prepared and frankly more likely to be the victim of these types of attacks. And obviously, any money that would have taken for them to prepare is a whole lot less than what they are going to eventually have to pay, having had been the subject of one of these attacks.
Yes. And just to give you another example, we've seen lots of issues with business enterprise compromise in a combination of phishing, social engineering. Whenever there's transfer of funds, significant funds from Latin America to the United States, or from the United States to Latin America, we see these, attackers getting into the systems and finding ways to provide different accounts and exchange the email exchange. I'm sorry, interact with the email exchange, and you end up sending the funds somewhere else. We had conversations with the FBI about this, and this is an increasing activity by attackers, and in things that, to be honest, they can be avoided with proper training, double verification systems in the process of passwords, and having robust programs and making sure that you have your everything that you require to avoid these types of attacks. But the lack of investment in deterring the conduct, it's making an increasing case of attacks in the region.
Yeah. So maybe, Guillermo, as we kind of wrap here, I'm interested in a question that I think we get a lot from clients, is around what does the enforcement environment look like? You mentioned a couple of times that you think that's being led right now out of Brazil, but that there are other regulators that are particularly active in AI and other areas. Interested in your perspective, first across the region, and then maybe where you would want to point companies to about those enforcement priorities that you're sensing.
Well, definitely cross-border data transfers are a reason for enforcement. Also, it's silly, but the fact that you don't disclose properly your privacy notices, your privacy policies in your web pages, or that you are not appointing your data protection officer on the ground, become regular ways in which the authority finds out that you're not behaving properly on the data protection end, and this becomes a bit, an issue through a verification visit by any of these entities, and you end up then with an administrative fine because of that. So again, cross-border transfers of data, making sure that your policies are aligned, but also having the ability to respond to the inquiries and the enforcement of the rights enforcements of data owners. Many companies do a poor job whenever a Brazilian or a Mexican want to find out more about their own data managed by the company. And you have sometimes a person, a data protection officer in the US or in Europe responding to these inquiries. And these inquiries come in the wrong way because they don't follow the protocols or even the common standards of the local regulation. And they then become another reason for the authorities to come into place. But certainly the most concerning one is the security standard, the cybersecurity breaches, and not making sure, not sending the notifications on time, either to the authority or to the data owners whenever that is required. I would say is the most significant challenge for companies on the ground from an enforcement perspective. Now, being that said, it's hard to tell right now where clear enforcement trends will go in the region, just because we have so many different laws going on right now. But we can just assume that it is resembling a little bit of the EU system, and that risk-based came to the region to stay. So if you don't have a risk-based approach into the region, you should certainly make sure that you do it in the coming years, because that will lead you to trouble with local enforcement agencies.
Yeah, I think those are really good practice points, Guillermo. I really appreciate your sharing them with not only with me, but with our larger audience. And I think we'll probably be having future podcasts, if you're willing to do so, about all of the developments that are happening in the region. But this overview was super helpful, as many of our multinational clients and followers of this podcast are trying to stay ahead of all of these developments, which seem like they come fast-paced and in volume. And so your expertise across the region is super helpful.
Thank you, Scott. I love doing this, and hopefully we had to get the chance to talk a little bit in further detail of some of these regulations, how they look like, and certainly always happy to help anyone out there with trouble in the Latin American region. Thanks for having me.
Terrific. With that, I'm Scott Loughlin. This is the Data Chronicles, and those were your data points.